You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Over the last 10 years or so, we've talked about pretty much every aspect of the brewing process ad nauseum at this point. We've gone down numerous beer rabbit holes, and honestly, sometimes we just need a break from beer. As much as we all love beer, and trust me, we really do, there are other things we enjoy just as much. It's not like we invest 100% of all of our mental and physical energy into just brewing and beer. We have other hobbies as well, some of which are what I would say are beer adjacent a little bit, by which I mean it either relies on similar processes or it's just great to do with a nice cold pint in your hand. So you are listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to share our views on these beer-adjacent hobbies of sourdough bread making and barbecue is contributor Will Lovell.
Oh, I'm kind of excited because now we get to go a little bit off-piste as it is, and we can go talk about some other things that are really fun that, like you said, are kind of beer adjacent. I think a lot of home brewers out there take up the hobbies of baking and barbecue. It just seems kind of like they go hand in hand. And so let's just kind of dive into them today, and I look forward to all this.
Yeah, pretty much since the start of this podcast, which was back in 2017, we've received numerous requests from people who hear us mention other stuff we're into to focus more on some of these things on the show. So after 7 years, 346 episodes, we finally decided to do just that. If you're listening now and you're feeling frustrated that a beer-focused podcast is talking about something that's not specifically related to beer, well, sorry, not sorry, I guess. For those who don't make bread or enjoy the fine, if a bit messy, art of barbecue yet, and decide to continue listening anyways, I do thank you for that. Perhaps you'll get something of value out of this, maybe even muster a little bit of motivation to try out something new for yourselves. Now, this is a Brews Views episode where we allow ourselves to speak a little bit more freely than usual. So please keep in mind that we might use language some people don't like so much. And I promise it's not our point to offend anybody, just to have an honest and kind of fun conversation in a less filtered way. All right. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up next month, September of 2024, Brewlosophy contributor, the Brew Club leadership member, and co-host of this very episode, Will Lovell, will be taking the stage yet again to answer patron questions. I believe the last time you did this Q&A thing was about a year ago, Will. How you feeling about returning to the stage, as it were?
Oh, I think I'm really excited. I always love talking to our patrons. We got so many great people that support us that have so many great questions. And as I've said before, let's get kind of funky with it. Let's throw in some good things. Maybe some questions you might have from this episode would be a great platform to discuss some of those things. So bring it on.
Absolutely. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more per month by Saturday, September 21st, 2024, because Will's going to be taking questions on that Sunday, the 22nd. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When you're doing your online shopping, your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little bit of a commission for that referral that helps us to continue covering costs of running all of this stuff. Finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to do that, that would be awesome as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You are not going to be disappointed with any of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, or even just reasonably priced kettles and other brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Aaron Kopp from Mississippi wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 337, where Will and I talked about hangovers. We actually got quite a bit of feedback from that episode. Aaron said, I just wanted to send you an email to tell you that I loved this episode and thought I'd pile on some thoughts. In the words of Frank Sinatra, I feel sorry for those who don't drink. When they wake up, that's as good as they'll feel all day. A part of this passion for homebrewing involves sharing with friends and family. And if you're not having too much fun from time to time with those you love sharing this passion, then what are we doing? Homebrewing on many occasions has been the gateway to wonderful memories with family and friends. I loved Will's hangover classification system and refer to my exercising the demons as DEFCON 3, which is when my wife knows I'm struggling. I too choke down ibuprofen before bed when I sense a raise in the DEFCON level. My wife and I also throw in a B12 vitamin to the mix and chug water till we can't anymore before bed, proven to reduce DEFCON levels to 0. Lastly, a new discovery is the Alka-Seltzer hangover formula, which has caffeine and aspirin mixed into it. It is a game changer when you wake up with a sour stomach and headache, and it also helps with hydration, settling the stomach, and getting that pep back. 30 to 40 minutes, and I am ready for my day. What do you think, Will?
Oh, I think the Alka-Seltzer sounds awesome. Something else I've discovered is my wife bought the Liquid IV with caffeine in it. I don't know if you've seen those, but doing the Liquid IV with caffeine is a great way to pep up with some hydration as well. And so the B12, I haven't tried that, so maybe I need to add that into my regime here. I guess the goal is to not hopefully go so far all the time where I have so many hangovers, but it is nice to have some ways to mitigate the response the next morning.
Yeah, my wife definitely has bought, and we still have the caffeinated version of Liquid IV. I believe it's pineapple yuzu flavor, which is actually pretty good. So I've had that. I do find it to be pretty helpful, though. My go-to is always a cup of coffee in the morning. I definitely know DEFCON 3. That's something that I'm familiar with, Aaron. Though I should say that over the last few years, I have been a little bit more, I guess, vigilant in my drinking, which has allowed me to pretty much avoid truly gnarly hangovers for the most part. I still get them from time to time. Water is definitely my friend, but my problem with chugging a bunch before hopping into bed is that it's going to result in me having to wake up in the middle of the night to let that water out. And I struggle enough with sleeping through a whole night as it is that I don't want to do anything to disrupt what might be a decent sleep. So my current approach is to try to lay off drinking pretty much anything, including alcoholic beverages, about an hour or so before I plan to hit the sack. I definitely need to get my hands on this Alka-Seltzer hangover formula that you mentioned, Aaron, because it sounds like an awesome tool, even for just when you wake up feeling kind of tired. I mean, to be able to settle your stomach a little bit and have some caffeine with it. I think that's pretty cool, but definitely a cool tool for those unexpected hangovers. Thanks again for hitting us up, Aaron. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show. No umlaut needed. If you're listening to this podcast, I'm absolutely certain you're going to love the videos Martin is creating over at YouTube as well. Alrighty, when we return from this break, our views on sourdough bread and barbecue. We'll be right back. Level up your brewing game with one of the coolest brewing gadgets on the market today, the Easy Dens and Smart Rev Combo by Anton Parr. These smart tools provide precise gravity measurements and fermentation tracking with minimal sample volume, and it's all synced to your smartphone via the Brewmeister app. Brewlosophy's Martin Keene loves using the Easy Dens as it makes precise measurements high-tech, hassle-free, and honestly really cool. Visit EasyDens.com today and use code BREW15 for 15% off. That's BRU15 to get 15% off your order. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. We've all heard beer described as liquid bread, which I personally feel is quite fitting considering both are made with cereal grains and yeast. Now, I've always enjoyed baking. In fact, a good portion of my childhood was spent sitting on countertops, either helping or at the very least watching my mom or grandmother whipping up goodies, which is something my daughters both enjoy nowadays. However, it wasn't until about a year ago that I decided to try my hand at making sourdough bread, and I'm telling you, the bug is bit. I'm obsessed with both the process and the outcome. Now, to be clear, I've always loved sourdough bread, eating it at least, and have wanted to try making it for myself. I know it got really popular during COVID for a lot of people, and I resisted the urge even then for what I imagine are some of the same reasons a lot of other people, are kind of not wanting to get into it. And perhaps even some people who are listening to this episode now, the main one being my fear of screwing it up. If you just go and watch, YouTube videos or you go read some blog posts, the process does seem very convoluted from the outside looking in. Now, now that I've been doing it for, almost a year now, and have many, many loaves under my belt. In fact, I'm going to be baking a loaf today. My perspective is quite a bit different, namely in that I realize how silly my prior fears were. If that sounds familiar, it certainly did to me, when comparing sourdough bread making to beer making. It's not as hard as a lot of people seem to make it out to be, or seem to view it as being as well. Now, I've heard the same thing from people interested in homebrewing, right? And that's why I bring that up. But that's not the only similarity. Will, what is your, general view? I know that there's sourdough being made in your home. Is it you who's involved in that, or is it mostly your wife?
So first, I want to start off with the bread making is really cool, and it is essentially fermentation. I mean, typical baker's yeast is cerevisiae, and sourdough is we're going more into mixed culture. So now we're going into the kind of milk the funk kind of phase of things, which is pretty cool to think about with bread. But in my house, I'm doing mostly the consumption and then sometimes the maintenance. My wife is the one that during COVID, she got the sourdough bread starter actually from our neighbor, already had one. Interestingly enough, our neighbor used to live in California, and she brought a sourdough bread starter from a friend with her. The starter's name is Quentin. Apparently, it's common to name your starters. So I'm looking forward to hear if you've named yours yet or not. So we have Quentin 3 or whatever iteration ours is, and and typically I usually do the consuming of bread and finding of random recipes. My wife usually executes, but I've definitely fed it when she was busy and couldn't get to it, and it's not really a daunting process. It's just you have to be diligent with anything else. You have to be diligent, you have to stay on top of it, and you got to keep those microbes kicking.
So we're going to get into a little bit about my perspectives on that very topic there, because I think it does differ a little from the kind of popular perspective on sourdough starters and maintaining them and all of that. But to answer your question, I did not name my starter in the same way that I've never named a car. I've never really gotten into the anthropomorphification of, inanimate objects. And so it's never like my brain doesn't work that way. Again, to remind people, I've tried watching Lord of the Rings a million times and I fall asleep every single time, but I could watch a documentary, 24/7 and it'll keep my interest. Like it'll keep me awake at night wanting to learn these things. Anyways, I feel like that might contribute to my kind of hesitance to name these inanimate objects. So mine doesn't have a name, but if you want, Will, if you want to come up with a fun, kitschy name for my starter, I'd more than happy, to let you do that. And then when I'm talking with you about it, I'll use that name. But
we're going to go with Stormageddon. Stormageddon is your starter's name. There you go.
Okay, thank you. There are some similarities with brewing when it comes to making sourdough bread beyond just the fact that it's cereal grains and yeast. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is that there are a million opinions on every little aspect of bread making, and people have this interesting tendency to get a little bit feisty when somebody does something different than them. If you've ever spent any amount of time, say, on the homebrewing subreddit or in one of the homebrewing forums that are out there, you know what I'm talking about. You put on that you made a lager and you fermented it at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1,400 people and their mom come along to tell you that you did it wrong and that you're going to have a terrible result. It is an insanely similar experience, at least for me, with bread making in the sourdough bread making forums. People are very married to their approach as being the one approach that works well. I did happen to find this really cool Facebook group. It's called I think it's called Sourdough Rebel, or Rebel Sourdough Bread or something like that. And it's a bunch of people who are totally cool with others making bread however they want to make it, as long as it works for them and they're happy with the outcome. Now, I'm going to talk about the ways that I've made sourdough bread in a minute, but a good segment of the sourdough crowd might come off as a little bit sanctimonious at times or judgy, but for the most part, they're just as cool as homebrewers. And I feel like I've made some really neat connections in the sourdough world. Now, you mentioned starters. People in the homebrewing world are going to hear starter and automatically think probably about, a little amount of wort, a small volume of wort that you pitch your yeast in to prepare that yeast to go into a batch of beer. A sourdough starter is a little bit different because it's more the way I look at it is it's treated a little bit more like a Solera, where you're prepping that starter prior to each batch, but you're using that starter over and over and over again. So when you hear people say something like, "Oh, I've got a 100-year-old starter," what that means typically is that the starter was originally created 100 years ago, but you're taking a chunk of that out to make bread with every time you make bread, and then replacing it at some point or in some way, again, we'll get into that, with more fresh flour and water. So it's not like you're using bugs that are 100 years. I mean, maybe, who knows?
I'm sure they've reproduced several times over and died off several times over, but cool story based on starter age. So one of the local, it's a brewery and kitchen. It's called Wild Barley here locally. And the brewer is also kind of the executive chef, but all their bread and pizza dough is all sourdough. And it actually came from his grandmother's starters where it all originated. So, cool. So he's been feeding it for that long. And so you're kind of like, it's really cool because that's kind of attached to like his family's, kind of lineage of baking, which is really cool.
I love it. Yeah, I love the stories. That's the other cool thing about sourdough is that you'll find these people who've been doing it for a long time and have just awesome stories about where their starter came from, what they've done with it over the years, stuff like that. Now, my starter I made completely from scratch, which a lot of people seem to struggle with. I don't know if they're struggling with the actual making of the starter or if it's just a lack of patience, which we can all relate with on many levels, particularly, as it relates to brewing, those first few batches where you're going, I'm not seeing the bubbling you're supposed to see, and it's only been 8 hours, and you wake up the next day and you got airlock activity. It's kind of the same with making a sourdough starter. It's just the process is drawn out a lot longer, at least it was in my experience. When I started mine, it was just with first off, starters really, in my opinion, they should be 100% hydration, meaning you're using the same amount of flour and the same amount of water. And the reason for that is just that when you're designing recipes later on down the line, if you know your starter's 100% hydration, then that's not going to have an impact on the total hydration of your loaf. And that is, once we get into hydration, that you get a lot of opinions, but that is a very important aspect of making sourdough bread. So I started with a 100% hydration, just blend of flour and water. And then I did a pretty standard process of pouring out half of that and then replacing with more, let's say 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. And then you do that for 2 weeks. I did it once a day. And then after I started to see a little bit of activity, I bumped it up to once every 12 hours. So morning before work, night before bed. And I did that for another 2 weeks. So I was full. I actually had to leave. I went to Costa Rica at the time when my starter was still in the process of being made. And I just left it in the fridge for, 7 days and came back and then just re-upped the twice a day feeding until it was just super hearty and showing activity really quickly. And then from there, this is where I kind of diverged a little bit from the traditional way of doing things. I went and made a large volume of starter. It's not huge. It's maybe like 400, 500 grams, so that I could make bread with unfed starter, which is a really kind of controversial, as controversial as you can get when it comes to bread making, a controversial technique that more and more people seemingly are starting to go that route because it's easier. You're not having to worry about ripening your starter ahead of time or getting it, up and going prior. It might take a little bit longer for your dough ball to start to rise, to double in size. But it works for me. And now, I go back and forth between a more traditional approach and then this kind of lazier way of making sourdough. And I've done side-by-side comparisons just to get it out there up front. And the breads taste exactly the same. The crumb structure, again, we'll get into that in a minute, but it is a little bit different, I guess. But again, I wanted to get this out up front. You don't have to stress about your starter nearly as much as you might think you do based on what you see on YouTube and, read on blogs.
So my wife feeds her once a week, and usually we just kind of are like taking some of the excess of what's coming off of that ripe starter, and that's what we're using for our bread that's going on. And keep in mind, all these cultures, like the culture you grew on your counter is, even though our starter's technically from California, from a neighbor, all these cultures are a little bit different. I think it'd be so cool if we could get some project in the U.S. to go through all these sourdough starters and start mapping them out on what's growing in there. And just kind of anecdotally, what I've noticed with our starter is that usually the loaves that I have tasted and said, hey, this is kind of notably sour, did you do something different? Those are when she's done an unfed starter and just grabbed it off the top. And so I think it's kind of cool that yours doesn't do that. But to me, like when I've noticed kind of more of that sourness in the flavor, it has been from an unfed starter. So it could be that your culture is just different than mine, or maybe I'm more sensitive to something, or it's all in my head. But usually I'm not so over her in that bread making process that I would know what was going on, to be honest.
Well, I'll tell you what, you make a very good point. So we're going to talk about the actual sourness or the acidity of sourdough bread. And one of the common things that people will point to as contributing to increased acidity is time. And so, cold fermentation or putting your dough ball in the fridge and allowing it to really slowly ferment is said to increase acidity. And so the fact that an unfed starter is naturally going to take more time to, double the size of your dough ball, that would ostensibly, right, increase the acidity as well. Well, Will, I've got a little thing to tell you because we design experiments all the time at Brewlosophy. What I did was I timed it so that the dough ball of the unfed starter would be sitting for about the same amount of time as the fed starter so that I could eliminate the acidity as being an issue. And I put the fed starter one in the fridge for a little bit longer. So it could have been that mitigated the difference in acidity. But I will say that even my unfed starter breads that I make are not, they're not sour like you would expect from a store-bought sourdough loaf. And what I found out is a big reason for that is that these commercial bakers are usually just adding, citric acid or something like that to their dough to give the impression of sour, but they're making it, for the most part, like they would a normal rustic loaf with, commercial yeast. So that's something to keep your eye on. If you think you like sourdough because it's tart and you start making sourdough yourself, chances are it's not going to be that same acid level as you get from like a kind of a less expensive store-bought sourdough. At least that's been my experience. What about you, Will?
So I would agree with you. I don't think the sourness we get from her starter, whether it's fed, unfed, or whatever, is near as tart as what you would buy sourdough from the store. Because I used to think I did not like sourdough. And part of what got us down this path is our neighbor, she got her starter and she was feeding it every week and she wound up with this excess bread loaf that she couldn't eat. And so she brought brought it over. And lucky us, we had this like peasant loaf that we got to chow down on. I'm like, this is so clean and good. Like, I didn't know this could be sourdough. Like, it blew my perception out of the water.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what took us down this path. And so, but again, I think there are little things like, again, your culture is going to be different than whatever our culture is, because these are kind of a wild cultured thing, which is pretty cool. I don't know how much correlation there is between sourdough starters. That would be something kind of cool to go look up on. But I do think that, like, when you do these, like, unfed versus like a ripe or fed one, I think there could be, like you said, the time and the stress and some of those things could potentially create more of this sour flavor. But again, it's nowhere near as sour as what you're going to get from like the store-bought stuff where they hit it with acid.
No. Yeah. I like that. And in fact, my wife has historically hated sourdough bread because of that, tart flavor. And when I started doing this, she was like, oh man, she's like, I would love to, eat all this bread, but she's like, I don't like sourdough. And I said, hey, from what I've been reading, and from the homemade sourdough breads that I've had, it doesn't taste the same. She loves it. She loves the bread that I make. And I'll talk about some of our favorite recipes, most of which have been inspired by her, making requests and such. But it's really just a fun process. And what I love about it is that if you compile the entire, it'll take 2 days to make a nice loaf of sourdough bread, give or take a few hours, depending on the approach you're taking. But if you take the amount of time you're actually working on it, and I'm not going to include the baking time because that takes seconds to put it in the oven. You're looking at maybe 15 to 20 minutes of total time invested, and you get this delicious rustic, handmade loaf that you can use for so many different things. I just think it's really awesome. One of the other it's not really a controversy, but I will say that the most recommended approach for developing your gluten, right? A lot of people will knead bread. If you're making a traditional loaf of bread, you're going to sit and you're going to knead it for 10 to 15 minutes to really develop that gluten structure, which is going to allow that loaf as it's baking to hold on to those CO2 bubbles and create your crumb structure. In sourdough, kneading is not really a popular approach. The more common one, and I know you're going to be familiar with this term, is called stretch and folds. And it's interesting. I think the reason they use it more in sourdough is because you're typically making a higher hydration loaf. I know some people who always go with 80% hydration, meaning for every 500 grams of flour that they're using, they're putting in 400 grams or milliliters of water, which is a very sticky, wet dough. But we're also focusing a lot on the protein content of the flour that we use to make these doughs, and that will make it less sticky and a little bit easier to work with. 80% is rough to work with, even for me, and I've made probably 100 loaves at this point. But the stretching and the folding, if you don't do that, oftentimes people are like, then how are you getting your gluten structure? There are other ways. I've watched a YouTube video of a guy who kneads all of his sourdough loaves because he doesn't, he'll make it in the morning and he doesn't have time to do stretch and folds throughout the day, and so he'll just knead it, let it rise, put it in the banneton, and then bake it, and it seems to work fine. The other way, and again, this goes along with kind of that lazier approach, is just to allow the gluten to develop over time, which will happen if you're using an unfed starter, because that unfed starter needs more time anyways to really get to work in the dough.
From what I've seen, helping my wife out, like stretch and fold or time is pretty much the way that we roll, because but time, a lot of times, like you'd be amazed how forgiving these sourdough loaves are, as far as just like, if you let them sit and rise, they will tend to develop over time regardless. And so I'm always so impressed with like how forgiving and how easy some of this is, because normally in my head, baking is such a precision thing. And with these, again, you're using them with kind of like imprecise cultures that you have some control over, but not total control over. So I think time is your biggest friend in a lot of these sourdough recipes.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I've read a lot about is with stretch and folds, it's a more gentle way to develop the gluten. It's exactly what it sounds like. You're taking a corner of your dough about a half an hour after mixing your dough up and getting it well incorporated. You let it sit for about a half hour to an hour. And then over the course of the following hour, every 20 to 30 minutes, so I guess it would be an hour or two, you go in there and you grab a corner of the dough and you kind of stretch it up as high as you can without it breaking, and then fold it over the top and then again, rotate, 25%, do the same thing. People do it 4 times all the way up to 12 times or so is what I've seen. And again, all you're doing is trying to develop that gluten, to really develop some strength in your dough ball there. And so I do it often. Sometimes I'll do kind of a hybrid approach, but what I've heard is by performing the stretch and folds in particular is one of the ways that you can help your bread to develop this looser crumb structure, meaning there's larger holes that are well dispersed throughout the loaf once it's cooked. Now, this is where I get really opinionated. I've made many loaves that look like the loaves that you see online. They're nice big holes. But I don't know why people love that so much, because the thing with me and bread is that I love to put stuff on it, whether that's just butter with maybe a little honey or making a sandwich out of it. Well, if you've ever tried to do that, spread something on a piece of bread that has, a 1/4 inch hole in it, it falls through. So I don't understand what the love is with this looser crumb structure other than to show off, to show people that you're able to do it. Even they will typically say that the bread tastes exactly the same. So what I've found myself doing is intentionally performing techniques that result in a somewhat tighter crumb structure so that I can put stuff on my slices of bread without it falling through onto the floor.
Well, and I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just thinking back to me watching Too Much Great British Baking Show and having Paul Hollywood tell me about the proof of the bread. And part of that is related to the kneading, the stretching and folding, all that stuff, but also the amount of time you let it proof. Because if you let it proof for too long, you're going to get really big holes. Because again, part of the reason it's proofing is it's getting warm. There's more CO2 creation happening. And then you can have an underproof where it's too dense. You can have overproof where it gets really big and then eventually collapses in on itself. And so the proof kind of also goes into this density of inside the loaf as well by those critters making CO2 inside of there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you go to a homebrewing forum online and you will see the predictable is this infected posts, and it's become a joke among experienced homebrewers. Like, all right, Christmas happened, so starting in January, we're going to get thousands of is this infected posts on every forum, and it's kind of fun. It's lighthearted. Well, the analog to that in sourdough brewing is, can you give me a crumb read? Why does my bread look flat like a puck, or it won't hold its shape or anything? That is usually a function of proofing, overproofed, underproofed, and it can lead to different outcomes. The thing is, a lot of people are just kind of guessing as to which one it is when you're asking online. And what I found is it can be really helpful for, at least in the beginning, when you're getting a feel for what a doubling in size looks like, to get one of those, it's a graduated like bowl or a container that you see in a lot of, commercial kitchens that has markings on the side. So you put your dough in there and you pat it down nice and flat. At least that's the way I like to do it. And then you can take like a dry erase marker and mark the side of this square. Mine's a square container. Mark the side of it, and then exactly when it's doubled in size, because you just know it's right above about halfway up or double the amount. So that's one little trick. I've stopped using my container altogether. I now just store unique flours in it because the bowls I use, I just kind of have a feel now for when the dough is properly rised. So again, my preference, my opinion is that a tighter crumb structure is more preferred because you get a little bit more bread in each bite and nothing's going to fall through. Another thing that contributes to this, and it gets a lot of focus, but I don't see as much like judgment and sanctimony around the ingredients used, namely flour. With sourdough bread, you really do want that chewier crumb. You really want that nice, crunchy kind of outside. And one way to achieve that is to use a higher protein flour, something in the order of about 13% or higher. 13 to 16%, I believe, is pretty kind of go-to. You can absolutely make sourdough bread with all-purpose flour. I've done it. Again, I've done comparisons with all bread flour and all-purpose flour, and the results were different, at least by your eyes, but they tasted very similar. Both were were delicious. Another fun little thing that I like to do that kind of goes against the stream a little bit when it comes to making sourdough bread is adding a portion of buttermilk in place of the water. And one reason I like to do this is you're getting the sourness from the buttermilk, which is really just kind of you can think of it as like a plain yogurt that's liquefied as opposed to being a little bit more solid or jelly. But you're also the fat from the buttermilk will fortify that bread a little bit or enrich the bread and make it a little bit softer. So you kind of get this hybrid, like it's a rustic sourdough loaf with the crumb of that's a little bit closer to say like a sandwich loaf.
Right. I don't know how I feel about buttermilk. I guess it would depend on what recipe we were going for. But I do think that, similar to brewing, water, flour, salt, and the starter that you're using, and then which types of flour, whether it's a higher protein content like bread flour or lower protein content like all-purpose flour. These are all just levers you can use to create a slightly different product. And so I think it's always good to keep these in mind and what ratios, because pretty much any sourdough pizza recipe is going to be very similar ratios of flour, water, and salt, right? So, there's not going to be that much creativity there per se, but these are all levers you can do to get maybe a different perception of what you want within this structure. Because again, everyone out there baking is using the same basic ingredients, but buttermilk's one I don't think I've seen my wife use terribly much, but to each their own. It sounds kind of interesting to try at least.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. The reason I used it and started experimenting with it in my more traditional sourdough loaves was that I made a sourdough sandwich loaf that turned out excellent, and it included buttermilk, among other things, different than your standard sourdough loaf. And so I started just messing around with upwards of 50% of the hydration came from buttermilk in a couple of loaves I've made, and the family always likes it. Again, it creates a little bit softer internal crumb, that's a little bit easier to spread on. And I don't know, it's just kind of fun to mess around with that kind of stuff. Now, some other stuff that gets a lot of talk in the sourdough world would be your proofing, the typical process for making a sourdough loaf. I'm not going to get into the finer details here. You can find that on many websites and YouTube channels, but you're going to, mix your flour, your water, your starter, and your salt. You're going to let that rise or bulk ferment in a bowl, for however long you need to until it's about doubled in size. You're going to dump that dough out. You'll pre-shape it on, your countertop or a cutting board of some sort, and then let it sit for a minute. And then you're going to place that into a banneton. Some people will just use like a linen lined bowl. That's totally fine as well. You're going to let that ferment for another few hours until it rises a little bit more again. This is when I cold ferment, is I'll throw it in the fridge overnight or while I'm at work all day. And then I come home, you dump it out of the banneton, you score it, you put it in a Dutch oven. That is the traditional way, or I'm not sure how traditional it is, but it is the most common way of making sourdough, is to put it in a Dutch oven and not to open bake it like you would, cookies or something like that. And you cook it with the lid on for a certain amount of time. You take the lid off, and when that lid is on, what it's doing is creating steam to encourage what they call oven spring. So a bigger rise, and it's what's responsible for that slice that you put in there, that score kind of opening up and really kind of creating this beautiful, ultimately finished piece of bread or loaf of bread. But then you take the lid off, and that all the steam goes away. And so you're going to develop some color and a nice crunchy crust on the outside of it. So that is the typical approach. One of the things that I found is interesting is that the recommendations for the temperature of your oven, you would think that most people just did the same thing, but there's a lot of variation in the way people approach this. The very first loaf I ever made, I preheated my Dutch oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for like an hour. I mean, 500 degrees. I don't think my oven has ever seen 500 degrees until I started making sourdough. And then you put your loaf in, and you immediately reduce it down to like 450 degrees. And then, you take the lid off and you reduce it again. And what I found is that that's just too much work. If I just keep it at 450 the entire time, I do all the preheating. I put the loaf in the Dutch oven. I cover it. I do 450 for 25 minutes, take the lid off, do 450 for 15 more minutes. And every single time, at least with my oven and the style of bread that I'm making, it works really well. Now, if I'm making sandwich bread where I'm not using the Dutch oven, I will go down to like 380 degrees Fahrenheit for like 35 minutes, and because you're not worried about as much about that crusty, development of that crust on the outside. But that's how I do it. How are you guys making? What's your baking procedure like?
So you've essentially described what we're doing mostly for our peasant loaf, which is in a Dutch oven. Now, my wife, she uses parchment paper when we put it inside of the Dutch oven. And what we found is that most parchment paper isn't rated over 425. So a lot of times we'll cook at 425 just to be within that spec, and that seems to work out pretty well. We've had to adjust a little bit of timing here or there, but it's not been like major. It's been like a minute or two, not like anything crazy. So we tend to do something similar. When I do the peasant loaf, I kind of want the bigger holes in there, because when I'm doing peasant loaf, I'm usually wanting that to go with that thick crust to go with like a soup or something, or a stew or something where you can kind of like dip it in the broth and eat it. And with the big holes, it's kind of good. And when I get that crunchy crust on the outside, like I really just want to like eat that all by itself even. But then we do have like some sandwich loaves. Like lately she's made this Italian bread loaf out of sourdough, and that just sits, we shape it and just sits on a baking sheet in the oven. And I want to say it's around a similar temp, like 425 or so. I'd have to go back and look at that recipe, but we just let it cook with some scores on top, and it seems to do really well. It makes a really good, I think 400 degrees is, I just found the recipe. It's 400 degrees just sitting on a cookie sheet, with just the loaves there. And it turns out really well. And then she has another one that's kind of like more like the traditional, what I thought of homemade bread growing up, where it's in the loaf pan. And she has another sandwich loaf there. And those all have really, more dense crumb in there, where it's like, again, you can put a sandwich, mustard, cheese, and it's not all melting through the middle of your holes. So, I think of, I see why you say you like, a little bit denser, bread loaf there, so you don't have to have as many holes. But I feel like, if we want to eat it with soup and stuff, I want her to make the peasant loaf. If we're going to make sandwiches, then she can make one of her sandwich loaves. And lately we've been making a lot of this kind of Italian loaf, which is like super good and pairs well with some of the homemade pastrami that I'm making. We'll talk about that in the next segment.
God, now you're making me hungry. So the reason that I do my more peasant loaves the way that I have, I've adapted my recipe, is because we kind of like the best of both worlds. We want that tighter crumb structure, but with that more rustic feel. And that's what we've come to. Now, I don't do it every single time. The loaf that I'm going to be baking in about 3 hours is total rustic. I did stretch and folds. I did use unfed starter, but my starter was fed.
What a gas!
What a gas! Was fed 5 days ago, I believe. So it's not super hungry. But yeah, that's the beauty of sourdough, is that you can do these things, and maybe the loaf that you make isn't an exact replica of what you made a week ago, but it's still good and edible. I really have enjoyed making a traditional sourdough dough, getting that ready, and then baking it like you would a loaf of bread for sandwiches. So you put it in a regular loaf pan, uncovered at a lower temperature. And like you said, it comes out way more sandwichy, but with all of the flavor of a nice rustic sourdough. Super fun stuff. Takes about the same amount of time with very little extra effort. In fact, it's a little less effort if you're not using the Dutch oven and all of that stuff. But there's so many approaches, a million ways to skin this cat. We'll put it that way. Now, I have developed some recipes over the last year that I've loved, my family has loved, and the people we camp with. I always take fresh sourdough when we go camping, a couple of loaves to just share with people for breakfast and whatnot. Probably the most popular, and I don't think it's going to be a big surprise, is the jalapeno cheddar loaf that I make. I actually prefer fresh jalapenos in mine. A lot of recipes you see will recommend the pickled jalapeno because it's a little bit more flavorful and adds a little bit of acid because it's pickled. So it adds a little bit of acid to the flavor of the bread. I've done it multiple times. It's delicious, but the fresh jalapeno really, to me, is just better. And the little secret that I do is I add to a normal size loaf. You're looking at about a 500 to 600 gram loaf. That's just the flour that you're using. I add about 10 grams of onion powder, which sounds weird, but it really adds just kind of this backdrop umami flavor that works so well with the Tillamook cheddar and the fresh jalapeno that I put in my jalapeno cheddar loaves. It's so good. Have you ever made one of these types of breads, these types of loaves?
So we haven't played with jalapeno cheddar. We haven't done quite that. We played more with, like my wife has made cinnamon rolls with her sourdough starter. Like it's kind of like, I've made beer with the sourdough starter. Have you ever made beer with your starter yet, Marshall?
I have not. No, I actually I've wondered about it, but it never really. I never got the spark to actually do it.
I mean, it is a brewing podcast. I'll talk briefly about making beer with bread, basically. But I had her feed her starter, and I took like I forget how many grams of excess, but it's quite a bit. And then I kind of like mixed in some wort to get it kind of mixed in, and I kind of did a Berliner Weiss kind of malt bill, and I added the starter into ferment at like 80 degrees in my garage. And I expected to get this kind of sour kind of lactic acid present kind of thing. I didn't really know what to expect. It was just kind of a pretty blank canvas to go with like a sourdough starter. And it tasted like a stupid loaf of bread. Like there was like no sourness except for maybe a hint on the nose. And I was so surprised at how clean it was. I ended up having to like add some more hops to get a little more flavor in there to make it drinkable.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to try it. There is that style of bread that's made with bread, style of beer, I'm sorry, that's actually made with bread. There's a few different ones out there. And so, I mean, it would make sense. You've got all of the microbes that, we use in the production of beer right there in a little starter, just with a little bit of flour, which shouldn't hurt anything. So yeah, I mean, it would be fun to try that maybe in a 1 gallon batch or something like that. Some other favorite recipes of mine, I've mentioned many times before, my wife is Latvian, and as all cultures do, bread is a big part of their culture. And there's a style of bread referred to as sweet and sour bread, or saltskapmais. And it's 30%, my recipe is about 30% rye flour. You put in a little bit of honey, a little bit of buttermilk, salt, and all of that. And you cook it more like you would a sandwich loaf. So it's not going into the Dutch oven, at least in the way that I'm making mine. And it comes out so delicious. It also, this is kind of, if you like caraway, put in about 7 grams of caraway. You just mix that into your wet dough as well. And it is so phenomenally good, up there with some of the best saltskapmais I've had in Riga, Latvia. I absolutely love it. My recipe is a little bit of a play on a traditional recipe I got from one of my favorite Latvian bakers, a family friend of ours, who I believe kind of adapted her recipe to include, like back in the 70s, to include, some modern stuff. So she does use a little bit of regular yeast, store-bought yeast, and I don't. Mine is 100% sourdough. And all I did is I took a little bit of my active starter and mixed it with some rye flour and water. So I now have a rye starter as well, and just absolutely delicious. Another fun loaf that I did was everything but the bagel seasoning. I think I did 15 grams of just the Trader Joe's everything but the bagel seasoning in a regular loaf. People really loved that one. And the loaf that we're eating on right now is a multi-seed loaf. So something like a Dave's loaf that you get at Trader Joe's, similar stuff. I bought the seed mix, a 6-seed mix off of Amazon, mixed in about 60 grams of that with the loaf. And now I've got a really nice high fiber, I put in some wheat, whole wheat in that one as well. So it's a nice high fiber, healthy loaf of bread. Absolutely delicious.
Yeah, I think all of those sound wonderful, and I think just people need to keep in mind that bread is pretty forgiving, especially even sourdough starters are really forgiving. I mean, we had one overproof the other day, and instead of cooking in the Dutch oven, we just laid it out on a cookie sheet and cooked it like a flatbread, and it turned out great. So it was flatter. It didn't have the structure we wanted inside, but it still turned out really delicious and really great, and we really enjoyed it. So this stuff's really forgiving, and there's probably, like, if you're thinking, well, you can only really make these peasant loaves or this thing, Marshall gave you a whole laundry list of bread that you can make, but go look online. You'll find all sorts of recipes, like anything that you can do with like normal bread. I'm relatively certain, to some very high degree, that you can probably find a sourdough equivalent where somebody with a sourdough starter is like, you know what? I'm going to make cinnamon rolls. You know what? I'm going to go make this. And so it's pretty much all out there. So could you make it with normal baker's yeast? Sure, but if you're geeking out on sourdough, as Marshall and my wife obviously are, then go out there and shoot, aim for the fences and go find you a recipe that's like looks fun. Again, the favorite thing my wife has been making lately is this Italian loaf. It has been so good for sandwiches. I've used leftover brisket and made like a brisket grilled cheese sandwich with that loaf, and it is so good.
I love it. Yeah. Well, that's the thing is that if you want to make, as long as you have a sourdough starter, you can make bread that's going to be delicious. Overproof your starter or overproof your dough. Just make focaccia. That's basically what focaccia is overproof dough with big holes in it. And you get to poke your fingers in it, put whatever you want on the top. I've made focaccia that's absolutely delicious before. You can't, again, it's like you said, Will, it's so forgiving. Just don't overthink it. It's the same way with making beer. Be patient when you need to. Recognize how robust yeast is. Don't stress too much about whether you've screwed something up. If you're a relatively clean person and you scrape down the sides of your starter jar after every use, chances are you're going to be just fine and that it's not going to go bad on you. Most of the time when I see pictures online of people who have moldy starters, it's because they left it out in a really warm area for way too long where mold develops. I've never had an issue. My starter is the very same thing that I started about a year ago, and it is working excellent. So give it a go. Sourdough is so much fun. Similar in some ways to beer, though, obviously different as well. And I've been loving it. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me about sourdough bread, and I'm happy to blow hard about that as well. We do have to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be shifting our focus to another beer adjacent hobby, one that you have arguably a bit more, we'll say, in-depth experience with as a Texan, and that is barbecue. We'll be right back. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
Imagine relying on a dozen different software programs to run your business, none of which are connected, and each one more expensive and more complicated than the last. It can be pretty stressful. Now, imagine Odoo. Odoo has all the programs you'll ever need, and they're all connected on one platform. Doesn't Odoo sound amazing? Let Odoo harmonize your business with simple, efficient software that can handle everything for a fraction of the price. Sign up today at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
I know it's not for everybody, but I love meat. And one of the things I love so much about it is the process of cooking it. Whether it's cold and rainy or scorching hot outside, there's just something about tending to meat on a grill, usually with an ice cold beer in my hand, that feels so good. And like both beer and bread, we get to eat the final results. We get to consume it and enjoy the final results in that way. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm dissing my sourdough and homebrewing homies out there, but I've found a similar mentality among barbecue nerds in that many feel their way is the only right way, which, as you might guess, I kind of disagree with. That said, I do feel like we should delineate the difference between barbecue and grilling. And given you live in Texas, where viewed by many as the barbecue capital of the world, Will, why don't you educate us on that?
Well, we've already started the first argument because while I agree that Texas is the barbecue capital of the world, there are going to be some people that do not agree with that statement. So I'm willing to take the heat, but if you can send me some pork that's better than brisket, I'm all ears. But so first off, barbecue versus grilling. So what is barbecue? So to me, barbecue is typically indirect heat. It can be direct, but usually it's about a low and slow smoking methodology. Whereas to me, grilling is going to involve direct high heat, where you're putting the meat directly over that high heat. I know most pit masters here in Texas are using like an indirect heat. I think Cooper's and Llano, which makes excellent barbecue, by the way, they still do it over direct coals, but they're kind of the exception to the rule. I know some other places around do it as well, but Cooper's is the only one that comes to mind that does actual smoking of meat over direct heat. You can definitely do it. They obviously have their process down, but most of us are using indirect heat inside of a smoker.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, is that the easy way for me to explain it to my kids when I was doing that is that barbecue is low and slow. Grilling is going to be hot and fast for the most part. For example, if I'm making a tri-tip, which is a very popular cut of meat here in the Central Valley of California, when I was doing that on a propane grill, for example, it would be done in 30 minutes to 40 minutes, right? Depending on the size of the tri-tip. When I'm making tri-tip on my smoker, you're looking at probably minimum of 2 hours, which for some people is like, why would you do that? Well, it's more than just flavor, which that's the big one, but it also results, in my experience at least, in a much more tender final outcome. And that has been my experience with every cut of meat style, whatever it is. It's just much more flavorful, but also way more tender. It's easier to control the final temperature of the inside of the meat so that you're getting more of what you want. Who hasn't thrown a steak on a gas grill only to overcook it because you walked away to grab another beer for 5 minutes? That is much more difficult to do on a barbecue, or when you're barbecuing, and that's one of the big things that I really value about it.
Yeah, and we'll go into some different methods of how to cook different cuts of meat. And believe it or not being from California, I have actually smoked a tri-tip before, so that's that's very interesting. I've smoked a whole lot of different meats. I'm kind of a guy that I'll try smoking just about anything. But let's lay some groundwork with some grills and lots of opinions around smokers and grills and things like that. So in Texas, I think probably the most wildly known is the offset smoker. And these are horizontal smokers that have a really large pit where the meat goes, and then they have a side firebox kind of off to the side. There's a lot of babysitting that goes along with this. To know your offset smoker, you got to know when to throw on kind of a greener log or a drier log to get your heat control going. But the really cool part about these smokers is that there's a lot of convection going over that meat. So that smoke is kind of just like coming across that meat from the firebox and then going out the chimney on the other side. And in my opinion, some of these offset smokers, you get some of the better quality cuts of barbecue, where you get that really thick smoke ring and just a really nice kind of like meteorite color to them. And then the cousin of this would be the vertical smoker, where the smoke is coming from the bottom and then convecting over the top of it with like some kind of heat shield. And there's some of those that are around, but those are more popular in other parts of the country.
Yeah, my very first smoker was a combo propane grill with a offset smoker on the side as well. It was huge, this thing. But it was like a Father's Day deal, and I ended up picking this thing up. And I probably spent 3 months trying to master the art of the thin blue smoke using wood chunks that fit in the sidecar, as it were. Every piece of meat that I smoked on that, whether it was poultry, beef, pork, just came out tasting so acrid. I knew I was doing something wrong. I didn't judge the smoker. I just judged my capacity for effectively, using that style of smoker. So I sold that, and I ultimately went with what is probably the most popular style of smoker these days, which is a pellet smoker. Those who are, really into the smoking game are scoffing at me right now. But using a pellet smoker, it's like a cheat code. And that's part of the reason I think a lot of people, snub their nose at users of pellet smokers. But man, I'm telling you, it's better than my grill ever was. And it's so much easier to use than an offset smoker.
Yeah, I think pellet smokers they're the easy button, right? They're just like you set the temp, you put in your your pellets, and then you just tell it to go, and then you can kind of hit some buttons and make the smoke level go up and down, and they're really consistent heat. You're not having to worry about heat control as much. Probably your offset smoker that you had, I'm guessing it was probably really thin metal, and in my opinion, some of the offset smokers that are like cheap like things are really hard to control anything on, because again, you're losing so much heat through that, like, very much like paper thin metal, that it's sheet metal that it's kind of stamped out of, and you almost need something a lot thicker to kind of hold in that heat and get all that going. In a pellet smoker, again, because it has, usually running off of propane or something, it has this heat source, and it can just give you, in a thermostat, and it can just give you the desired heat that you want. So it is definitely the easy button as far as smokers go. But that also leads me to kind of like where I sit. I've done the offset smoker. I like offset smokers, but kind of where I've landed out of versatility is one of the Kamado style smokers, which is it's also a grill. It's also a pizza oven if I want it to be. But basically, these are ceramic grills. You probably, the big name is Big Green Egg, Kamado Joe. There's a few other ones out there. I have the Costco version, which is like a Louisiana grill, and these are kind of like an in-between, and they're basically originated in Japan as an oven. And because they're big ceramic vessels, they can hold heat really well, and it's really easy to like maintain temperature. And so it doesn't get the convection of smoke going across the meat like you do in some of these other smokers. But again, the temperature control and ease of use is part of the reason I kind of like stopped on these, and I really enjoy using mine. And I also love the versatility where I can, put a heat shield on it and smoke a brisket. I can take the heat shield off and just do direct heat like a grill. I can even put a pizza peel on there with the heat shield and get it up to 600 degrees and cook pizzas on this thing. So to me, it's a very versatile piece of equipment. It's not a unitasker. I'm not really into unitaskers. I like multitaskers just for space considerations and use. And so like, it's really awesome to get this kind of grill where you can do all this big range of things on it. I've even I can only really do it in the winter, but I'll take the pellets from the pellet smokers and buy like one of those little snake tubes that goes through it. And if you light it on one end and keep it cold enough in the wintertime, you can smoke salt. You can smoked paprika is supposed to be like smoked peppers, but you can take like paprika from the store and like smoke it. And it's actually a really, really fun way to even do that. So, but I have to make sure it's cold outside because I don't want to get the temperature too high on smoking salt.
Yeah, or cheese. I mean, you got a cold smoked cheese so that the cheese doesn't melt. Now, my understanding with Kamados, though, is that, I know that there are different versions, but are they charcoal and then you add wood to the charcoal to create the smoke? Or how are you getting what's the source of the smoke?
So it uses lump charcoal, which is different than like the charcoal briquettes. And so you have to go specifically buy lump charcoal. But I'll usually get like kind of the big, I wouldn't even call them chunks. They're more like logs that I kind of split down into bigger pieces. And that way they burn a little slower, and I will put those in there with the charcoal. And so essentially, I'm getting all my smoke from the charcoal, and that gives it some smokiness, but I'm also that big chunk of wood that I'm putting in there. Typically oak, sometimes mesquite will also give that flavoring of that wood.
Yeah. So one of the big arguments that you'll hear against pellet smokers, and I think it's true. I've had plenty of barbecue from a traditional, huge offset smoker, and they have a characteristic smoke character that is undeniably there. Pellet smokers, you're not going to get as much of that. You will get some smoke character. You don't have to be worried about not getting that. And what I found, a little trick that I learned off of somebody on YouTube, is that if you start your meat on the cooler side. In fact, I think some pellet smokers have like a P or a smoke setting where you put it on and it keeps it at like 180. It creates a lot more of that nice thin blue smoke, and you can just kind of let your meat sit in that for a good 15 or 20 minutes before upping the temperature to where you want the cook, which is what you would normally keep it at, on an offset or maybe even a Kamado. But it's just one way to get a little bit more smoke flavor that seems to have worked quite well for me. But yeah, I've never used a Kamado. Justin Pretzer, who does the Average Brew reviews with us, he is a Kamado user. He swears by it, and he regularly brings barbecued meat over that is phenomenal that he's made on his Kamado. And he's also constantly bragging about how he's got one of those ones that has like you can raise the rack up and down in it, and so he does different things, and he'll get a raging fire going at times to just quickly grill stuff. But yeah, they seem to be pretty rad option.
Yeah, I would say the one downside that I found with it is I get smoke character that I want from it, but I can't quite get that like black meteor thing that you get from an offset. If you go to like Franklin Barbecue in Austin, like he just go on YouTube and look up Franklin Barbecue Austin. They're unwrapping those briskets and they look like a freaking black meteorite, man. They look rad. Yeah. And like that color, like anytime I see that color on a brisket, I'm just like drooling coming out the side of my mouth. And mine don't get quite there. It's more of a deep mahogany than it is like black like that. But you know, for ease of use, for me only doing one brisket at a time, basically, I'm pretty cool with that. We all make sacrifices, but for me not to have to sit out there and babysit, you know, if I'm working from home on a Friday, I can just get up a little early, throw a brisket on. I'm not having to babysit it the whole time. And to me, that's like an absolute win.
Yeah. I mean, again, you can learn how to effectively manage your fire and smoke in an offset. You do have to babysit it more. That's one of the things I think a lot of, diehard offset users like about it is that it takes effort. It's kind of a hobby, and it does result in what is arguably a higher quality smoked product because you're getting more smoke from it. But the pellet smokers, the Kamado grills, they work. And find somebody, a friend who has one, go out, cook with them and see which one you like the most. And that's what you can go with. What I will say is that I'm wholly of the belief that any of those options are far better than a propane grill. And I used to not believe that at all. I've ditched my propane grill since having my pellet smoker. And I've just got like a $600 Pit Boss that I got at Lowe's. I mean, it works fine. If I have to replace it, I have to replace it. I've had it for 5-6 years now, and it's still kicking. I haven't had a single issue with it. Very easy to use, set it and forget it type of deal. And as we move into football season, I mean, the thing gets used 4 to 6 times every week. We absolutely love the food that it creates. So one question I have for you, as a Texan, I know that when you're making brisket, you're probably going with 16 mesh, black pepper, salt, and maybe a little bit of garlic, and that's it for your brisket. But do you ever get into like seasonings? And if you do you go homemade? Do you go store bought? What's your take on that?
So for brisket, for basically any beef ribs, if you've never smoked good dino ribs, like that's one of my favorite cuts of meat out there. But yeah, I'm using 50-50 salt, pepper, like 1-to-1. There's nothing fancy going into that. A lot of times I'll probably rub it down with mustard, which probably doesn't have much flavor, or hot sauce or whatever, just to make the seasoning stick a little better, and it also helps the smoke stick to the meat a little better to give it better color. But yeah, my beef, even my steaks, I'm pretty much a 1-to-1 salt pepper kind of guy. But pork, to me, there's a lot more room for expansion because honestly, there's not a lot of flavor going on with pork and chicken and turkey breast and stuff like that. So, so maybe my turkey breast is I'm doing like 2-to-1 pepper to salt, because I like a really peppery crust on my turkey breast when I smoke them. For pork, I've got a rub that I got from a buddy of mine when I was in college named Bob, and he was from Central Texas, from Brownwood, and I don't have all the ingredients pulled up in front of me. If you want this rub recipe, it's nothing proprietary, but it's got brown sugar, to say the least. It's got, salt, pepper, paprika, mustard. It's got a whole bunch of different things in there, onion powder, garlic powder, and it's a much more complicated rub that I'll use. And depending on what I'm cooking and when, I'll also kind of use a mop sauce as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm so I don't understand the love for really coarse black pepper. Nobody in my family likes it when I use like that 16 mesh coarse black pepper on beef, because when you bite it, it's kind of hot and all you taste is black pepper. I don't mind it, but I far prefer a finer grind. Maybe that's because I'm Californian, not Texan. I don't know. And I don't know what the argument there is. Maybe because it is crunchier, so it kind of contributes to the crust, on the outside of the brisket. But to each their own. Again, my go-to is, and I'm with the thousands, probably millions of other people out there who absolutely love Meat Church, and so every Father's Day I get a new variety pack of Meat Church seasonings, and they have never let me down. Every single one that I've tried is so banging. I love it very, very much. I use it on all the different styles of meat that I make, all the different cuts. I do also, I know that in some circles that marinating meat first is kind of looked down upon. Tim, Tim Meisch, who does the average brew with us as well. He also does the Pit Boss pellet smoker, and he always marinates his tri-tip, and it comes out phenomenally good. So some of the stuff I like about barbecue is the same stuff I like about brewing, is that you can kind of go off on whatever trail you want to. You're going to get people looking down on you, but who cares if you're making something that you like eating?
So I don't marinate things that I'm going to smoke necessarily. Usually if I'm marinating it, I'm going to marinate like steak fajitas or something. It's something I'm going to do like fast on direct heat. I don't typically marinate things that I'm going to smoke, especially beef, because I feel like, to me, like brisket and beef ribs are all about, you want the presence of smoke, and you have salt and pepper there because you need something to like kind of get a little bit of flavor. But to me, it's about smoke and beef, and that's what I want. Chicken, pork, some of those other things I'm a little more lenient on, like just because you need to add some flavor to it. So I don't usually marinate. Now, if you're really into hot and fast poultry, you should check out brining, because brining will really impart some moisture when you soak that meat in a salt solution. It'll bring all that brine in. The only thing I've smoked that I've brined is I recently did a venison pastrami, and so I did the brine for like 3 days, and then I coated it with coriander, black pepper, and juniper berries. And I kind of cracked them all together in a mortar and pestle, then just coated them and then smoked it for 3-4 hours. And that turned out super good. But that brine just keeps all that moisture and some of that saltiness inside of the meat that's just really delicious. But brining chicken is a really great method to cook that on direct heat as well, and to keep that moisture in there.
Any poultry, yeah, I agree with you. Did you harvest the venison yourself, or?
Yes. So essentially, place here in town, Wild Barley Brewery and Kitchen. I did a brew day with Holland, who's their brewer there, and then I went in there, and one of their best selling sandwiches is they have this like homemade pastrami Reuben that goes with this sourdough bread, to kind of relate into what we talked about earlier today. And man, I was like, surely I can make a. My wife's making this great Italian loaf. Surely I can make this pastrami. And so I'm like, well, brisket would be more traditional, but I wonder if you can make it out of venison, since I have like a whole bunch of venison in the freezer. Hunting season's coming up. I probably need to clean some of that freezer out. And sure enough, I found a recipe, and it was pretty banging, and it's super good. I've been eating sandwiches with that Italian loaf and this pastrami, and I have no regrets.
I want some so bad, dude.
It's so good. Oh man, my wife said, "This is the best venison you've ever made."
Yeah, to our listeners out there, Will has been sending pictures to the Brulosophy crew of this pastrami that he made, and it's mouth-wateringly delicious looking. So let's talk a little bit about some opinions on the different types of meat, different cuts of meat, stuff like that. I know that brisket, when you really start to get into the whole smoking thing, brisket gets talked about as being kind of the king of smoked meats. And understandably, unfortunately, because of how popular barbecue has gotten, brisket is like the most expensive cut of meat in part because it's so big. But the last time I bought a brisket, I made it for, I think it was our last Christmas party. I think I spent $130 on this brisket, which you're just like, God, and it takes forever to cook, and it does all. Here's the thing, and I know this is going to make a lot of people, their heads spin. It is by far not my favorite cut of meat. It's good, it's really beefy, which is great. I like it, but there's so much that I like more than brisket, that to the point where I've had to struggle to like, why do people love this cut of meat so much?
It's because you haven't been to Franklin Barbecue in Austin and experienced it at its best. You're over in California, and I'm just saying, there's some places here in San Antonio. 2M on the south side of town does brisket as good as anybody. I will say this, though. I do not think brisket is my favorite. My favorite cut of beef is the beef rib. It's the big dinosaur ribs. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't even finish one by yourself, really, if you want to eat anything else. It is by far my favorite. There's just this richness to it with the fat. It's super fatty. There's a richness to it, and I think that's probably my favorite. But brisket is got to be my number 2, and it is the piece of meat to which all barbecue, at least in the state of Texas, at which I judge. And it's kind of weird to me that it was this kind of junk piece of meat that nobody wanted to do anything with, and that's why they started smoking it at all these like kind of meat markets around the state, because you used to have this whole cow, you'd butcher it, and now you had to do something with the bits that didn't sell. And so what do? Well, you start a barbecue joint in the back, and you start smoking brisket. And now this thing that was a junk piece of meat nobody could sell, packer plants are, with, big packer plant, commodity, butchering now. You just order packers of brisket from whoever you're ordering it from, and it's everywhere. But there are different opinions. So some people get prime brisket, which again is funny because again, this is a kind of meat that you're supposed to just be trying to figure out something to do with. And so, if I've got 20 people coming over and I'm expected to do something really great, maybe I'll splurge on some prime brisket. I've done a Wagyu brisket before, which was kind of rich and fun and super expensive. But you can also get away with just doing a choice brisket, which is also, you can still make some really nice brisket with choice. Again, typically so much of this is dependent on the steer that it came from, that pretty much if you're buying prime, you're just kind of hedging your bets that this is going to be a slightly better piece of meat, and you can get them for a reasonable price at Costco or your local supermarket. I get a lot from HEB, but Costco has some reasonably priced briskets as well.
Yeah, that's where I got mine. That was $130. It must have been prime. I think it was there was 4 left, so I just picked the best looking one out of the lot. But I like brisket, don't get me wrong, but it's just by far not my favorite cut of meat. What's interesting is that the story of brisket is kind of similar to the story of tri-tip. Back when I was a kid in Fresno, before I moved up to Seattle, any barbecue you went to, tri-tip was being made, and it was cheap. It was known as kind of a cheap cut, a trash cut. And part of the reason that it was cooked so often is because it was so inexpensive, and we figured out ways to make it good. It's now super popular. I think somebody was telling me that it's 8 times the price it used to be just 15 or 20 years ago now. If I go to Costco and I get a 2-pack of decently sized tri-tips, which is what I cook for if we're having a barbecue with neighbors and stuff at my house, that's going to cost almost $50 now. So it's not that much cheaper pound for pound than brisket these days. And that's just because of supply and demand. More people want it because they've realized just how good it is. Now, one of the unique things about tri-tip is that you'll see more and more people talking about, the typical approach that I take to cooking tri-tip is I'll season it up with whatever meat church seasoning I'm going to use. And then I'll set it in my smoker on a rack. So it's not even on the standard grates. It's on the rack above it. And I'll set it to say 220 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what that is in Celsius. But then I'll leave it in there for about 45 minutes, come and flip it once. And at this point, it's still floppy and mostly raw, but it's starting to take on more color and more flavor. I'll go another 45 minutes, and then I'll kick the heat up to about 300 and just let it finish. And I take it up to a medium in the middle because that's what most of the people in my family want to eat. And I just take my cuts from right in the middle and I give everyone else the outside, which is more cooked. But it's great. I have tried, though, this kind of modern technique of cooking tri-tip like a brisket. Have you ever done anything like this?
So I'm curious. So brisket, part of the reason you cook it like it, I usually cook around 250 to 275. I cook mine a little hot for some people. But the reason you're cooking it for so long at such a low heat is you're waiting for the fat and collagen to break down. And so you're pushing that meat up to upwards of 200 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature because it's starting to get to about that 190 to 200, 205 where all these collagens are breaking down. And you went from this tough piece of meat to now it's kind of got really juicy and lots of, moisture and fat and everything just kind of rendering out inside of it. Tri-tip though is kind of from the end of the sirloin roast, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, please correct me. And so you don't really want to cook that up to 200 degrees necessarily. So are you just basically talking about smoking it until it gets to, I don't know, 140, whatever medium is, 140, and then pulling it off and searing it, or what are you doing from that method?
This is the weirdest thing. I thought the same exact thing that you're talking about. It is literally cooked just like a brisket. You're taking it up to 200 to 205. I pulled mine at 203. And it does the same thing. It breaks down whatever collagen is in there. It really just liquefies the fat, but you're no longer pink. If you have a pink brisket, the only pink you should see is the smoke ring. It's that, your typical brown color, and it feels, and in my experience, it tasted an awful lot like a brisket, a little less fatty, but one little trick that I've found in doing it this way. I don't prefer tri-tip cooked this way, by the way. I like, pink center. But you can buy Wagyu fat on Amazon is where I got mine. And so I'll just take the brisket, make a little foil boat, or not the brisket, the tri-tip, make a little foil boat, put it in there, rub some towards the end of the cook, rub some Wagyu on it, and that will kind of seep in, or at least I tell myself that it does, and also impart some Wagyu flavor. It works really well. If you Google tri-tip cooked like a brisket, you will find a ton of videos, a ton of write-ups on it. It's a really kind of growing in popularity approach to cooking tri-tip that takes way too long and doesn't result in the style of tri-tip that I tend to prefer, but it is good anyways, and it works out. It's a good way to kind of emulate a brisket, I guess, if you don't want to spend the money on a whole, packer brisket.
I would think it would turn into just shoe leather at that temperature, because usually like a sirloin, if you overcook that sucker, it is so tight. But maybe there's enough in there. But here's the next question: Are you somebody that wraps your briskets or your tri-tips like in foil or in butcher paper? Because here wrapping is something people get in fights about.
So I will say that the last brisket I made, I did wrap it, but I used I went with the Meat Church approach, and so I used butcher paper, not foil, and it turned out so good that I don't see a reason to not do that. But as we move into other types of meat, yes, there are other cuts that I wrap as well. When I'm making tri-tip, the way that I make it typically, which is not like a brisket, I don't wrap it at all. No.
Oh yeah. So, I don't think you would wrap a tri-tip. So brisket, I've settled on, using butcher paper as well. I think that's what a lot of barbecue places around here do now. But if you are in a pinch, you can use the old Texas crutch, as it is called, and you can wrap it in foil, and you can get and because it's wrapped in that foil, it gets steamed, and all that meat gets kind of steamed and tender. And so maybe you don't get the structure that you're looking for when you cut into a brisket and it stays together in a slice, but you will wind up with some tender, delicious meat at the end of it all. And if you're in a hurry, accept no substitutes, I guess.
Yeah, wrapping in foil will decrease your total cook time because it holds that heat in with the steam, like you mentioned. At least that's been my experience. So one area where I always wrap is with pork, at least when I'm making a Boston butt. Now, you'll hear pork shoulder or Boston butt or pork butt or whatever. My understanding is that a Boston butt has the bone in, and pork shoulder often doesn't have the bone in it. I've cooked both. In fact, our Costco, I believe it's our Costco, sells pork butt in pairs. Like you get two smaller cuts that are boneless. They worked out just fine, but I'm a much bigger fan of getting a nice 13-pound Boston butt, which has that bone in there. One of my favorite things to do in making pulled pork is, when you pull that long, low and slow cooked pork butt, I do mine overnight. I mean, it's a good 16-hour cook. Is when you pull that bone out and it just slips out, no meat on it, and it's nice dry bone. God, I love that.
So, what's funny is so pork butt is not really a big thing here in Texas. Like, it's not something I seek out at barbecue places. Some places have it and I'll try it. But in the same way that it's not really a thing, it's also kind of liberating because there is no right or wrong way to do it here. Whereas if you're in other parts of the country where pork butt is king, they have kind of a right and a wrong and lots of opinions. But here, if you make a pork butt, nobody really expects anything or has expectations because nobody in Texas cooks them, right? So it's actually a pretty fantastic place to be. So I have my pork rub that I use. Again, it's got sugar, salt, pepper, garlic powder, onion powder, and I coat that sucker on. And that sugar is really great in there because it helps with the caramelization around on the crust. But I also use, with most of my pork, I use what's called a mop sauce. And this one's got a vinegar-based one with vinegar, sugar, whiskey, mustard, and some other spices in there. And it's just a way of keeping moisture and also adding flavor. So with brisket, if I'm trying to keep moisture, I'll usually use a spray bottle where I'd have a 50-50 water and apple vinegar mix where I'll kind of spray the corners as we go along every hour or two. For pork, I like to use this mop sauce because, again, after about 4 hours of smoking, the rub is pretty well on there, and then I can come back around and I can just add a little bit of this mop sauce, and it just kind of keeps the moisture going, and then it also creates this additional sugar layer that kind of gets darker and darker over time, and that sugar, as it caramelizes, creates this kind of meteoric look, which apparently I'm into. But I prefer bone in versus boneless. I've done both. It works fine. And I will either wrap or not wrap, but it just depends on what kind of time frame I'm in. I feel like wrapping, some people say it protects the bark on your butt. Some people say that it hurts the bark. I find that if you're into a little bit kind of crispier edges on your bark, that wrapping can kind of dull those down because, again, you're steaming meat inside of it. But again, if you're trying to cut down on your cook time, wrapping it and cranking up the heat a little bit will get you through a stall and into people's bellies a little bit faster.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that the main reason I wrap is to get through the stall, which all the stall is when meat gets to what I think most types of meat. Once it gets to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, it starts to produce moisture, which, as you know, moisture does is like sweat. It's going to create this cooling effect, and it can be really difficult to get your meat to get up higher than that until that moisture is done. If you wrap your meat, again, this is all based on just things that I've heard people on YouTube talk about, but if you wrap it, it holds that heat in better, and it can help you to push through a stall. Even with wrapping, I prefer butcher paper over foil, but that stall can take a good hour and a half, 2 hours. There have been times we've been recording podcast episodes, Will, and I'm like, hey, I got to go check my meat. I just wrapped it this morning, but I like to wrap it. And the thing is, when I'm making pulled pork, which I do probably 6 to 7 times a year, most of which is during football season because it's just nice and cool outside. And it just works so well with watching football. When I'm making it, I pull it off and then I'll let it rest in a cooler, wrapped in a towel. I'll take the wrapped, butcher paper wrapped pork butt out, wrap that in foil, put a towel around it, and set it in a small Yeti cooler and let that sit for 4 or 5 hours tops. 1 hour or more. I pull it out and then I start snacking on the crusty bits while I'm pulling the pork. So it doesn't really. The bark isn't something that I'm terribly concerned with. I just want the flavor in there. And so another little trick that I do is I'll pour off all of the juices that collected during that rest period, and then I put it in a fat separator, and I'll pour in about half of whatever, probably a cup or so of just the juices without all the fat. You got more than enough fat with the pork butt the way it is, but pour that in there to really just kind of soften it up and give it that nice flavor from the pork. And I love it. It's one of my favorite things to cook. Again, it does take a long time. I'll usually start mine at about 8:00 at night, wake up in the morning. It's in the stall temperature. So I'll wrap it then. And then about 3 hours later, I'm pulling it off, and family loves it.
See, I like to have those crunchy bits of bark intermingled into everything else, just because, otherwise it can just feel mushy if you're putting it in with a sandwich. But I guess you can kind of subdue the mushiness. Like I'll put coleslaw on my pork butt sandwiches, because that's a different sides is a different story. But my favorite cut of pork, which is not the king of pork other places, but here, when you go to a barbecue place, probably the first thing on the menu you're going to see is brisket, and really close down next to it's going to be smoked ribs. And here in these parts, that's usually spare ribs. Sometimes they'll trim them to be a little bit more of a rectangle, like a St. Louis style rib, which is just a spare rib rack that's been trimmed up a little bit better. But to me, spare ribs are probably my favorite cut of pork to cook. They don't take terribly long. They're pretty forgiving, and you can get a whole lot of flavor in there for like a 4-hour cook. And that's, again, I use kind of my standard pork rub, and then I also use that mob sauce, and I do not wrap my ribs. I will let them just cook, and then I want all those little kind of crunchy bits on the end. So maybe the ribs on the far ends of it will get a little bit too crispy just because of how thin it is, but everything in the middle is going to be super good, delicious, with a nice little pasting of crust on there. And I don't add any ketchupy barbecue sauce, just that mob sauce and whatever caramelizes on top is what's there.
So good. We love ribs as well. We don't make them nearly as much. I wouldn't say it's even on the top of my favorite meats, but it is absolutely delicious. It's Tim's favorite. So, we'll go down there and he'll make us ribs, and I get my kind of rib fix down there. We'll just hit on a couple of more types of pork before moving on to poultry. One of my favorite, and I don't know if I'd ever had just regular pork loin before, but I believe pork loin is it's the chop and the tenderloin together. And so kind of like with brisket, where you've got your lean and your fatty, with pork loin, you've got this kind of on top of each other. So each cut has a little bit of that darker kind of tenderloin cut with that lighter pork chop cut, and it's so good. It's really easy to cook. Takes maybe 2 hours, takes on a lot of flavor, and you get a ton of meat for a really good price. I think a standard loin will weigh, I don't even know, 3-4 pounds, and it might cost $13 or $14, something like that. And it's really, really good. Flavoring, or the seasonings that you use really go well with it because you can taste it. I've done like Italian seasonings. We've gone the barbecue route. Really fun one to cook. If you don't want the chop part of it, you can just buy tenderloin. Usually comes in 2 per sleeve, and cook those up. That'll feed your family of 5 real easily. Very easy to cook, delicious, very tender as the name would suggest. And then also pork chops on their own. bone. Absolutely delicious. We do that all the time too.
Yeah. So, the one thing I would say with pork chops, whether it's a full loin or just like, so to me, if you buy a pork loin, typically they're just going to give you kind of that back strap from the pig. Usually there's no bone involved. If you buy a tenderloin, usually it comes in a 2-pack, and it's hard to explain where that is, but it's kind of like inside of the back on the animal where there's not a lot of things going on. Like they don't use that muscle very much, and that's why it's so tender. Yeah, and that's why it's the tenderloin. But either one of these, whether you're doing them together as a whole rack or a separate, you just got to watch your temperatures. You don't want it to get too hot because it will dry out on you because there's not as much fat in there as yours with like a pork butt. And so it's the same thing. But you can use direct heat, you can use indirect heat. Again, you can do whatever you want for seasoning. I usually like to kind of season it with, I don't know, there's a Tex Joy is a common seasoning around here. Some other seasonings out there are typical, whatever season you want to, and I'll smoke it until it gets to an internal temperature. I think it's supposed to be around 140 or so, and then I think it's supposed to cook them to 145, and then I'll pull it off and I'll kind of do like a reverse sear in a pan just to get that crust on it. And that's really probably some of my favorite ways to do those leaner cuts of pork is just kind of do a smoke and then do a reverse sear on it, because that's always a really, really good way to get a lot of flavor in.
That's another topic that I feel gets a little bit of there's a little controversy there, is whether to sear your meat or not. And I've done it both ways with various types of meat, and I just don't necessarily feel like there's that huge of a benefit to searing after cooking or smoking. But it looks prettier, and I get that. And I guess with certain types of meat, but my pork chops, I do that one down on the rack. I'll start them up on the rack first and try to get as much smoke flavor as I can, but then I'll crank the heat up to like 400, open up my baffle, and kind of sear them on the grill, and mostly just to finish the cook and to look good, but they taste so good. And really, it is very important with pork. You don't want to dry it out, you don't want to get too hot, but smoking it on one of these low and slow grills is a lot easier to achieve that right temperature than it is on a propane grill, and it tastes so much better in my opinion. So that's just what we do. I don't even have a grill anymore. I just use a smoker. In terms of poultry, there's everybody has probably had somebody who has spatchcocked a chicken and cooked it on their smoker. It's absolutely delicious. One of my favorite things to eat on a work night, because with chicken, you're not really looking for, at least in my experience, Will, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not looking for like a lot of smoke flavor. What you want more than anything is that nice, tender, well-cooked meat. And spatchcocking a couple hens, or I've done every year now for Thanksgiving, we do a spatchcock turkey on the smoker. It is the most tender poultry that you've ever had. It's so much better than in the oven. I can't even explain how much more we enjoy poultry on the smoker than we did cooking it in the oven.
Right. And if you do it on a lower temperature, it also helps you quite a bit because you're not drying it out quite as fast. Another way to, because part of the problem with poultry is like, you have these, especially during a whole one, the thighs and legs can go up to, 185, 200 degrees and still be tender and moist. And in fact, if you're just cooking like thigh and leg quarters, which I like to smoke a lot, I will push them up to 160, 175 all the time. And they're still very moist and still has a lot of good fat in there to kind of keep that thing good. But when you do a spatchcock, you have those fatty cuts of meat plus the really lean ones on the breasts, and so you have to kind of like mind your P's and Q's about where the breast is at, because you want that to get done. And so we know where the breasts are, but it's fine. So you want to keep all that going, so you're kind of cooking like this whole thing, but it's so good doing it low and slow. You keep a lot more moisture inside of that bird when you're not like just going it so fast to heat. And, the bones on the spatchcock, if the heat's coming from below, the bones kind of protect a lot of that meat and stuff from going over too fast. And so it really is a great way. Beer can chickens are a lot of fun. I don't know that it's any better than a spatchcock, but it's always fun to violate a chicken with a beer can for some reason. So it's just always a good time. It's a good excuse to go buy a 6-pack of PBR or Miller High Life and just go to town. But probably my best bang for the buck as far as price and as far as like just quality that I like on there, I probably smoke the little leg quarters more than anything. And make sure to lift up the skin, put seasoning under the skin, and then put seasoning on top of the skin, because what's going to happen, you want that perfect bite through skin, and I can get it some of the time. but I can't get it all the time. And so there's always going to be that one piece where you take a bite, the skin's going to fly off, or you have that neighbor that comes over and the first thing they do is take the skin off and throw it in the trash, and you just like die inside when you watch them do it, but you live with yourself. And so to me, it's really about like season under the skin, season over the skin. And if you're going to smoke them, you can smoke them all the way up to about 175, 180, and it will get enough fat rendered out from under that skin that you can kind of get towards that like bite through, perfect bite where you get the bite through on the skin and the meat, and it's just delicious. So that's what I'm shooting for. If you're going to use direct heat, then I would definitely recommend a brine. If you're just going to smoke the breasts by themselves, then I'd probably recommend bone in or do a brine or some combination thereof, because those things dry out fast.
Well, the trick that I've been using, at least with my pellet smoker, is to not even brine chicken breasts. We do chicken breasts all the time, and I'll cook like 7 or 8 of them. And what we don't eat for dinner is I mix in with salads for lunch at work, and so I don't brine them. I have, and it works great. But what I do is I cook them up on the rack, so they're further away from the actual heat, and they cook more in that convection that you were referencing earlier. And as long as you're monitoring, I use my brewing ThermaPen. I monitor the temperature of each of those breasts. As long as you're not going over about 165, 170 on the chicken breast, you're not going to get that dry. I mean, it could just be a bad lot of chicken breast, but I've had great success with that. What I haven't had much success with is the skin issues, like you talked about, getting it crispy enough to actually bite through like you would if you did it over a grill, like a high heat grill, or frying it. But there are some little tricks that I've tried that seem to help. One of them involves like baking soda. You rub baking soda on the skin, and that's supposed to help dry it out and crisp it up. I still haven't achieved what I would say is like a perfect skin, but the meat is so good that it more than makes up for that lack of a good skin. Now, the last type of meat we're going to talk about is fish. If you've never had smoked salmon, fresh off of the grill, you don't know what you're missing. It's one of my favorite things to eat. It is like candy if you do it right. And it's so easy. It actually takes less time than most other cuts of meat. So good.
So I don't have a lot of experience smoking salmon. Salmon's not really my favorite piece of fish out there. So my wife loves it. But the thing that I've probably smoked the most of is kind of similar to salmon in the fact that it's really fatty, is when we lived in Cuba, at the Naval Air Station there in Guantanamo, we would catch mackerel all the time. And mackerel is a really oily fish. And so I would brine this mackerel, and then I would put it on the smoker and I would smoke it, and then you could pull it off, and it would just make this like smoked fatty fish that you could just eat on crackers with some like sharp cheddar cheese, because you had the smoky fish and the sharp cheddar, and like you could just eat it on crackers like any kind of cured meat, and it was so delicious. Or you could make smoked mackerel like chip dips and whatever, and it was so good to do it that way. So fatty fish are going to smoke better than some other ones. If you're doing tuna, you're going to probably want to do direct heat and go really fast, kind of more like a steak. But like fatty fish, you can definitely get away with doing a lot of things, especially if you brine them ahead of time. You can kind of get that salinity, mellow out, or even that salinity, and keep it from drying out too bad, and just smoke it. I think internal temp of fish is about 140, 145, somewhere in there. So that's kind of what you're shooting for.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And one of the questions that I'll get from people who come over for, say, a football day, and we've got this just huge amount of pulled pork that I've made. There's no way we're going to eat all this. What are you going to do with all the leftovers? Just trust me. It's very, very easy to figure out what to do with leftover smoked meat. Some of our favorites are, if, let's say we're making sliders, pulled pork sliders with coleslaw, for a Sunday. Well, the next day my wife will make nachos with pulled pork, and they're for dinner, and it's phenomenal. And then the next day after that, maybe we make tacos, or we do something else like that. And I use it for breakfast. I mix it in with some scrambled eggs. It's so good. I love having leftover meat. I'll eat it cold right out of the fridge just because it tastes so good. Do you have any special things you do with leftovers?
So one of my favorite things to do with leftovers is make a brisket fried rice is a great one, where you just like cube up the brisket, and then you can make just fried rice with brisket in it, and it's so delicious and good with all the smokiness. Brisket and eggs is like a favorite, and you can even add like some onions and peppers and saute the brisket. I think the key for leftover brisket sometimes is to saute it enough where it gets kind of crunchy, and so you have that kind of crunchy brisket in with the eggs and some onions and peppers, and then you can either put that in a taco, or you can just crisp up brisket and straight up put it in a taco with your leftover coleslaw and make brisket tacos for the next day. And similarly, brisket nachos. So I have used leftover brisket for almost anything. The other day, I think I mentioned earlier, like my wife had that beautiful Italian loaf. So I cut up the brisket, I sauteed it till it got kind of crunchy. And then I put it in there put inside of this loaf with some American cheese, and then just made like a brisket grilled cheese sandwich. And it was so stupid good. Just a little drizzle of barbecue sauce in there. And it's just like you're crunching into it and all that cheese and smoky goodness is in there. One of the more exotic things I've done with both brisket and pork shoulder is make boudin.
Oh.
There used to be a guy, he's out of Longview. I think he's at Sunbird Barbecue now. But I had a chat with him when he was working at Bodacious Barbecue on Moberly Avenue in Longview, Texas, which is where I'm from. And he was making this like brisket boudin. And so I kind of got to talking with him on Facebook Messenger, seeing like, hey, what's your kind of methodology here? And so what we came to the consensus of is what you're going to do is you're going to take this brisket and kind of cube it up and maybe re-smoke it or recook it for a little bit. But then you're going to eventually get it back in a pan, saute it until all this moisture is kind of out of it. And then you're going to add either Dr. Pepper or Coca-Cola back to it to kind of put some moisture back into it. And then now you're going to mix it with some seasoned rice, and then kind of whatever you want. You can do caramelized onions, you can do green onions, whatever you want to add in there otherwise. And then you're just going to stuff it into sausage casings. And then now you're going to go back out there and smoke it again in the sausage casing to get like this nice smoked brisket. It's already smoked brisket with like this smoked brisket boudin, and it is so good. And it feels kind of wrong because boudin's kind of this is what we do with the leftover cuts of meat to get some protein and filler. But it's so good when you do that. And you can do the same thing with pork butt. I've done it with pork belly before as well. I went out and smoked a pork belly and then kind of cut it up and did a very similar process. But I almost always, when I smoke a brisket, I have a big chunk left over. And so it's kind of like, well, what do you do with this? And if you got some time on your hands, because it's not an easy leftover, but it's a great way to repurpose it where it tastes like something completely different.
I am so insanely hungry right now after talking about this stuff. I think it's pretty fair to say that similar to bread and beer, barbecue requires a decent amount of patience. So that's kind of the one thread that weaves all of these things together. And that's the beauty of it. You know, the older I get, the more I like doing things that take a little bit of time. And you can kind of, you get to tweak little elements of it. And that's just what I love so much about both bread and sourdough. That is all the time that we've got for this episode. Hopefully you all out there enjoyed listening to us talk about something other than beer. If you didn't, that's okay. If you did, let us know. Maybe we'll do this more in the future. Did you have any final words on sourdough bread or barbecue, Will?
Well, just so people know, I understand that other places have barbecue that isn't brisket and beef and that they are very proud of it. And I'm sure it's very excellent there. But for this boy who lives in Texas, brisket is the king with some other things following close behind. So I'm willing to acknowledge that your barbecue is probably okay, but it's probably not what I think of as barbecue. And for that, we'll just have to agree to disagree.
Well, at the very least, I enjoy eating my barbecue. So that's what's most important. Don't forget to listen to and subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they're doing on our favorite beverage. And make sure to head to brewlosophy.com to stay current on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
On November 13th, it's the dawning of a new era when the NFL debuts in Germany, live on NFL Network. Brady and the Bucks.
Touchdown Tampa Bay.
DK and the Seahawks.
Puts the ball up, making a catch.
Wake up and watch with the world. It's Sunday Morning Football. Live from Munich. Sunday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, only on NFL Network.